Hi everyone, and welcome back to Harp and Guitar, People and Music. So Old Whiskey's got a few more recommendations here for you on this ongoing series of blues essentials. And today I wanted to talk about, obviously, harmonica players, or in the blues vernacular, as we like to say, harp players. I wanted to kick things off here today with one of the more influential harp players, and that would be James Cotton. Now, James Cotton was one of the pioneer harp players from the early 50s through to, really until the 80s, when he did a lot of his recordings. And he continued to tour until the late 90s and early 2000s, until his passing. Now, some of James Cotton's earlier recordings were done at Sun Records with Mr. Sam Phillips, who's obviously famous for recording an early Elvis Presley and so forth. But James Cotton also did a lot of his early stuff with the Muddy Waters Band, and a lot of early Muddy Waters recordings. You can hear James Cotton playing. But as I mentioned, he was a great harp player and a standalone artist in his own right, because he went on to form the James Cotton Blues Band in the 70s and did quite a few extensive recordings and released a lot of albums. And he's one of those guys that I would recommend that if you come across an album and you see James Cotton in the title, it's worth your while and probably worth some money out of your pocket to pick up a James Cotton album. His harp playing is very powerful. Lots of use of the wah-wah to great effect. He's a master at the cupping technique and cupping his hand to create that wah-wah-wah sort of sound. And because he's rooted in the South and he's from Mississippi as well, and really cut his teeth helping to develop the early Memphis blues sound of the late 40s and 50s, what would later become known as rhythm and blues and eventually rock and roll. So really he's one of the founding fathers of rock and roll as well. Some great songwriting, but his harp playing is very powerful and fantastic stuff. Now, aside from James Cotton, another blues harp player that I want to talk about is my personal favorite, and that's Sonny Boy Williamson. Now, there's a little known fact, or sort of a semi-known fact, that there were actually two Sonny Boy Williamsons. And I'll talk about that in another video, so stay tuned for that one. But for the time being, I want to discuss Sonny Boy and his recordings and the style of harmonica playing, or blues harp, that he played. Now, what made Sonny Boy a little different from James Cotton, for example, or a lot of the guys that started in the South and went up to Chicago, was that Sonny Boy didn't really move up to Chicago. He basically stayed based out of the South for most of his career. He did go up to Chicago to do a lot of recordings, but that wasn't his main base of operations for the majority of his career. He was in Mississippi and in Memphis, Tennessee, and various other large locations in the South, way more often than he was in Chicago. Now, the other thing about Sonny Boy was that he had a huge and extensive recording career, much like a lot of the fellows that I'm going to be talking about through the series. And that's part of what makes it essential listening and some really influential recordings. But because he had such a long and extensive recording career, again, there's a huge library of stuff out there. And a lot of the really good quality stuff you're going to find on Chess Records. It just seems to be that Chess really had that recording, capturing and recording that Chicago sound. They really had that on lock. But Sonny Boy played in a little bit of a different style, in the sense that he didn't put the harmonica right up tight against the microphone all the time when he played. He often left a little bit of a space there, so it wasn't that sort of crunchy reverb sort of sound that's the Chicago blues sound is famous for. He still kind of had a little bit of that country blues or acoustic blues feel to his recordings, even when he did go up to Chicago. Now, old Sonny Boy here was another fellow that did a lot of touring. He eventually made his way to Europe and the UK as well. And there's quite a few live recordings of Sonny Boy playing as a guest artist or as a featured recording artist in a lot of film and record recordings through the 60s and I think the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on the date on that. I can't quite recall off the top of my head when old Sonny Boy passed. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and you can see here with this album where it's Sonny Boy with Eric Clapton and the Yardbirds. Fantastic album where you can really tell that a lot of the early bluesmen had a huge influence and a huge effect on some of these British and European blues guys that were to follow in the 60s and 70s. Now what Whiskey likes about Sonny Boy here is that he played that wah-wah effect to fantastic mastery as well. And that's something that I really dig, and that's something that I try to emulate in my playing. Again, his cupping technique was really second to none. And he was almost able to make his harmonica talk, or make it sound like it was talking, the way he would cup the harmonica and use this wah-wah sort of method. And again, just his vast library of recordings. There's so much available out there. And that's one of the reasons why Sonny Boy Williamson, or technically Sonny Boy Williamson #2, as he's known, is one of my favorites, and one of the recommendations that I would make for blues harp players. Now, Sonny Boy was a huge influence on another one of my favorite blues harp players, and somebody that I would highly recommend, and that's Junior Wells. Junior Wells was a fantastic young bluesman who also had a pretty long career, really. He did a lot of recordings with Vanguard and with Chess and Delmark, and as I've mentioned in other videos, he toured quite extensively in the late 60s and early 70s, and actually through to the mid-70s with Buddy Guy. And as a duo, they often opened for the Rolling Stones and other rock acts, and they would also made many dozens of appearances at music festivals, not just blues festivals, but rock festivals as well. Junior Wells has quite an extensive career. He started in the late 50s in his recording career, and he also experimented with an early rhythm and blues style that would later become known as rock and roll. And as he progressed in his style, he was influenced a little bit by funk music and by some early James Brown stuff. But Junior Wells was mostly influenced by Sonny Boy Williamson. And Junior also did a brief stint in the Muddy Waters Blues Band as Muddy's harmonica player. In fact, there were some recordings that were previously thought to be Little Walter that turned out to be Junior Wells. Now, as you can see here from Whiskey's collection of Junior Wells recordings, that he was based out of Chicago, and he moved from the South, much like Buddy Guy, up to Chicago. He was quite young when he moved to Chicago. Junior is actually originally from Louisiana, so he has a little bit more of that sort of voodoo sort of subject matter to his music. But as I mentioned, much like Buddy Guy and Muddy Waters before him, he moved from the South up to Chicago, and he really did help to build that South Side and West Side Chicago blues style. Now, one of Junior's most influential records and one of his most sought after, and the one that I would recommend the most if you can find, is Hoodoo Man Blues, featuring the Junior Wells Chicago Blues Band. This was his first solo recording as an independent blues artist, and it's on Delmar Records, and it's become known as a classic. And as you can see here, it says with Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy was on guitar and backing up his friend Junior for Junior's first solo album. But actually, the original copy of this, which I do not have because it's quite sought after and pretty expensive, but the cover says, rather than saying with Buddy Guy, it says with friendly chap, because at the time Buddy Guy was under contract with Chess Records in Chicago, and therefore technically couldn't appear on an album of another studio such as Delmark. So they'll know that fact there for you. Now, Junior Wells' style is very deeply rooted in the South. It's influenced in a sort of a Southern style, and as I mentioned, highly influenced by Sonny Boy Williamson. In fact, a lot of Junior's early material are reworkings of Sonny Boy's songs. But he took his original style, these sort of influences from the South and from Chicago, and to help to amalgamate this into his own unique brand of harp playing. And as I mentioned, his subject matter and a lot of the topics in his songs had to do with voodoo and some of the practices which are referred to as hoodoo, the spells and curses and a lot of the folklore beliefs involved with the voodoo religion. So that's Junior Wells, one of Old Whiskey's favorites, and very, very highly recommended. And finally for today, last but not least, I've got to mention Mr. Jimmy Reed. Jimmy Reed is a fantastic blues harp player. He's got what some would consider sort of a swampy kind of a blues sound, very relaxed, very easygoing. He doesn't tend to use a lot of fast rhythm patterns. He's kind of very slow and methodical, and kind of like a steamroller, you know. He before you know it, his grooves are on you, kind of thing. And his harp playing is very, I guess, simple, for lack of a better term, but there's a form of magic and complexity in the way he plays his harp. Now, he's a bit of a one-man band because he would also play guitar, so he would actually wear his harp on a rack around his neck and blow and draw through the harp that way while his hands are playing guitar, obviously. So that lends a little bit to the style of his playing. But also he has a very heavy southern drawl, and this also, I think, only serves to add to the laid-back and easygoing style of Jimmy Reed's playing. A lot of bending and some fantastic, what I would call slow drag blues rhythms from a master like Jimmy Reed, who, by the way, played Carnegie Hall. So, and if you can find that album, Jimmy Reed live at Carnegie Hall, definitely worth a few pesos if you can find it. Now, for me, I just picked this up at a local record shop because it was a great deal and it had a lot of his classic recordings on it, and it really exemplified his style of playing. So yes, once again, I would highly recommend Jimmy Reed. Okay, everyone, so I think that's going to do it for today for another edition of Whiskey's Blues Essentials, and some recommendations for you fellas to maybe check out if you get a chance. And you know, some of these great blues harp players. Let me know what you think. So once again, I want to thank everyone for swinging by and checking us out here at Harp and Guitar, People and Music. And let us know what you think. And as usual, please don't forget to give us a like and subscribe over here to Harp and Guitar. Talk to you again real soon, folks. Have a great one. Thanks a lot. and bye-bye.